Amen. You guys can take a seat. My name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm excited to be here this morning. How about you? All right. It's good to be back after a week off, but Jody killed it last Sunday, didn't she? That was an amazingly inspiring message about how to be salt shakers and share the flavor of Jesus with our world. And I kind of want to pick up where she left off as we continue this Beyond Me series, where we've been taking a look at what God has to say about how we can live the lives of impact that we were created for, how we can leverage what we've been given to spread hope and joy and love across our city and across our world, and how right here, right now, we have everything we need to do that if only we'll be bold enough to try. July 2nd, 1982 was an infamous day in American history. It was a pretty normal day, all things considered, up until the evening when the pilot of a DC-10 jet radioed into the control tower as he was making his descent into Los Angeles that there was something on his radar he didn't think should be there. And then a whole bunch of other pilots started radioing that in, and all of a sudden the control tower freaked out because it was clear there was a UFO in the skies above California. And this DC-10 pilot decided he wanted to get a closer look, and so he banked around to see what this thing was on his radar, and as he looked out the window, this is what he saw. That's Larry Walters in his lawn chair. Larry was a truck driver who had a routine. Every day he'd get off work, grab a six-pack, go home, walk into his backyard, sit in his lawn chair, and finish his six-pack. And because those are the ingredients for almost every great idea that's ever been known to mankind, one day Larry was sitting there and he finished his six-pack and he thought, I should tie some balloons in my chair, get a better view of the neighborhood. And so he did what men do when we have ideas. He called up a bunch of his buddies, like, you guys got to come over here. I got this plan. And they all finished a six-pack. And afterwards they were like, Larry, we got to tell you, man, this is a great idea. And one of them had a hookup for some helium. Another guy had a hookup for some weather balloons from a military surplus store. And on July 2nd, they put the plan in motion. Larry strapped himself to his lawn chair. They filled up 45 weather balloons with helium. And then Larry gathered the supplies he thought he would need: a sandwich in case he got hungry, CB radio, a pellet gun to shoot the balloons when he wanted to come back down, and last but certainly not least, a six-pack. And then his friends cut him loose. But the problem was, none of them being physicists, they never calculated how fast Larry would go up. And he took off like a rocket. In a matter of seconds, he was at 16,000 feet. In fact, he ascended so quickly that he passed out. Didn't wake up till he heard the airplanes circling him. And Larry would later admit it took him about 45 minutes to release the death grip that he had on the arms of his lawn chair and reach for the pellet gun. But by the time he did that, everybody knew about it. LAX had to be shut down because he drifted into their airspace. And so all the flights to Los Angeles were being rerouted as Larry began to shoot his balloons. And when he made it to the ground, after taking out a power line and knocking out electricity to a whole grid of the city, the cops were waiting to arrest him. But before they did, a reporter ran up and shoved a microphone in his face and said, Larry, why did you do it? And Larry Walters famously replied, well, I guess I got tired of just sitting there. I think in faith, it's easy sometimes to just sit there, to allow our church chairs to become like prisons of inertia, kind of like Larry's lawn chairs. We just go through the motions of following Jesus. We show up on Sundays and we get filled up with a whole bunch of information, a whole bunch of knowledge. But that stuff that fills our heads doesn't always permeate our hearts and our hands as we walk out the doors back into the real world on Monday through Saturday. It doesn't change the way we're living. And if we're honest, I think all of us have sometimes felt a little bit empty about that. Like we come and we hear this stuff and then we don't put it into practice, and something about life and something about faith and work and everything else feels empty. Like there's gotta be something more. And what I wanna tell you this morning is there is. God has a plan for your life that is so much bigger than just your life. He's inviting you to be a part of what he's doing to make all things new and set all things right and draw all people to himself. And my hope is that today, some of you would have a Larry Walters moment and decide you're tired of just sitting there. I know you hear that and maybe you're thinking, wait. Larry was an idiot. But I don't want to have a Larry Walters moment. I don't want to be like Larry at all. What he did was crazy and dangerous. And to that I say yes, but I'm convinced that right here, right now, maybe more than ever, the church is desperate for some crazy people who are willing to go out and live bold and be dangerous to the darkness around us, not by flying our lawn chairs around, but by giving our lives away, by using the resources that have been placed in our hands to write a better story for a broken world. I just think for too long, so many of us have convinced ourselves, and maybe we've got this message from the church, but either way, we've bought in hook, line, and sinker to the idea that following Jesus is about trying hard not to sin. That's mostly it. And don't get me wrong, sin is destructive. We should avoid it at all costs. It will rob us of life and hope and peace. But just trying not to sin is a tragically small way to live. Like I open up my Bible and I read the story of Jesus, I read the gospel message, and I feel like he's constantly beckoning us forward. He's inviting us to get up and stop just sitting there and go try to do something right because of his love that lives inside of us. And in fact, that's what he told his disciples, that's what the church would be known for. We read about it in John chapter 13, verse 34. He's at the Last Supper. He's gathered all of his guys together. They're sharing this meal. He's like, you guys, a new command I give to you. Love one another. And that's not new, but he's not through. He says, in the same way that I loved you, that's how I want you to love one another. And that's a whole different level, right? Loving each other the way Jesus loves us cranks it up to 11. And they didn't even know in that moment all that meant. But they were about to find out in a few days while they watched him get beaten and bruised and give up his life in love for them. And he looked at him, he said, hey, this love that you've seen in me, this love that you're about to see in me, if you can love each other with that kind of love, the world will sit up and take notice. That's what you're created for. That kind of love is the way the church is supposed to be characterized. It's the thing by which we are supposed to be recognized. He says, by this, everyone will know you're my disciples if you love each other like that. And I hear that, I think, what a cool vision. Can you guys imagine what the world would be like if all the people out there who are skeptical about what we believe were intrigued by how well we treat each other and blown away by how well we treat them? What a world. And I realize that in 21st century America, that might not be our reality, but you guys, that is the history of the church. Before parts of the Bible had ever even been written, this ragtag group of nobodies who were following Jesus absolutely rocked the greatest, most powerful empire the world has ever known. They took over the world. They captured the hearts of people all across the planet because of how they lived and how they loved, because love for them was not an intellectual concept, it was something that inspired them to go out and do stuff. Like such crazy stuff that the people around them wanted Christianity to be true before they even understood it. And John, the same John who recorded that conversation Jesus had with his disciples at the Last Supper, later in his life, he wrote a few letters. And in one of those letters, he gives us kind of a clear picture of what it looks like to live this out, of what it takes to be a community that reflects Jesus to a watching world. So if you have a Bible with you this morning, you can open it up to the book of 1 John, chapter 3. It's way in the back between 2 Peter and 2 John. If you don't have one, no worries. We're going to put the words up on the screen. And if you need one, please take one or two or however many you need. Take some kids' versions from the Next Steps table in the back. They're free. But before we dig in, I want us to understand something about this letter that we call 1 John. Like John was an eyewitness who watched Jesus' entire ministry in a front row seat from the day that he burst onto the pages of history. And by the time he wrote this letter, he's an old man. And everybody else around him, every other eyewitness has been killed. Peter's dead, Paul's dead. They've all lost their lives for the crime of sharing the love of Jesus with the people around him. Jerusalem has been sacked, the temple's been burned, and John's this old man looking back at all of that. John, who by the way is the first guy to ever write down that God is love. That's a uniquely Christian idea in the history of the world. This John sits back and writes a letter to the Christians in the first century church. And this message that he has, it's not easy to hear. It might be challenging for some of us, especially those of us who found comfort in our routine of just sitting there. But my prayer this morning is that if you're not a Jesus follower, or if you used to be, you'll find this so encouraging and inspiring that you give Jesus a chance. It's powerful. And remember, this is written by a guy who's given everything. He's been tortured, he's been imprisoned, he's been mutilated, he risked it all, and he held nothing back to share the story of what he saw and spread the love that he experienced. And in 1 John chapter 3, verse 11, he writes this, "For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another." I mean, don't miss this. John says love is not master's level Christianity. This is following Jesus 101. This is where we start. We start with love. And then he gives an example of that from the Old Testament, talking about Cain and Abel. And then in verse 14, he writes, we got no doubt that we have passed from death to life. Why? Because we sat there for a while and tried not to do anything wrong? No, because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. John's trying to paint this picture for the church, that love is the foundation this entire movement is built on. And the question is, what does that look like then? How do we know what this love is? And he tells us in verse 16, he says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. He says, you want to know what love looks like? It looks like a perfect man allowing himself to be beaten and bruised and bloodied for the sake of a bunch of sinners who rejected him. John's like, look, I saw love. I saw love in human form. I saw love wrapped in skin. I experienced it. I lived with it. I watched love give itself up, give everything, give more than it had to spare for my sake so I could be forgiven and set free. And because of what I've seen, I've come to the conclusion that there is no other way forward for us. If we get it, if we can wrap our minds around the mega love of God that caused him to look at us. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty messed up. To look at messed up people like us and be like, I want him in my family. I want her in my family. I would do anything. I would give everything to have them in my family. If we get that that's the kind of love God has for us, then the only way forward for us, John says, is to follow in his footsteps and give up our lives for each other. That's what we were made for. We were created in love for love. And for me personally, I know the beauty of Jesus is the beauty I'm chasing. But it begs this question, who then do I need to love? I'm aware I owe a debt that I can't pay, right? I owe God more than I'll ever be able to repay because he did for me what I couldn't do for myself. But who else do I owe? Who am I supposed to show this type of crazy, radical, generous, self-sacrificial Jesus love to? Well, John says we're supposed to show it to our brothers and sisters. That's who. But who's that? Is that my immediate family, my actual brother and sisters? Is that my church family, like Christians? Is that people who look like me? People who come from where I come from? People who talk like me, people who think like me? Is that my brothers and sisters? Sure, but also, when John uses that phrase, it means for him the same thing it meant for Jesus. And back in the day, we read about what Jesus says in answer to the question, who are my brothers and sisters? Luke chapter 10, he tells this story of a Samaritan guy finding this bloody, beaten, broken Jewish guy on the side of the road. And Samaritans and Jews were like racial enemies. They hated each other. And he says this Samaritan guy saw this Jewish guy, his enemy, and he had pity on him. He picked him up. He put him on his own donkey. He made sure that guy got healed and that guy got taken care of, even after his own people, religious dudes and priests included, had left him for dead on the side of the road. And in that story, Jesus makes it clear that for his followers, your brother and sister is anybody your life crashes into who could use some love. Anybody your life crashes into who could use some love. No exceptions, no asterisks, no nothing. Anybody you see who has a need you can meet, that's who you're supposed to love like Jesus loved you. Rich or poor, PhD or GED, black, brown, yellow, or white, anybody, because that's what Jesus did. That's what the cross was all about. It said God so loved the world, not just part of the world, not just the part that looked like Jesus and talked like Jesus and came from the same place Jesus came from, the world that he gave his only son. You guys, what's so crazy and cool about this is that idea, right? That Jesus followers are supposed to express self-sacrificial love across all the lines that divide us as human beings. That we're supposed to be a community where everybody is welcome. That's actually where the name Christians comes from. See, in the first century, every major city had walls around it to protect it from being attacked. But one city was a little bit different. It was called Antioch. And Antioch, scholars believe, was the most diverse city on the planet at that point in time, even more so than Rome. And Antioch didn't just have walls on the outside, it had walls on the inside, separating every different racial group from one another. It had an African section and an Arab section and a Greek section and a Jewish section, and people did not cross the sections. They didn't associate with one another. And not only that, they hated one another. They had derogatory nicknames for the other racial groups and the other socioeconomic groups in the city. And then these Jesus people showed up, and they started talking about who he was and how he loved and what he did for everybody. And something happened that had never been seen in Antioch before. Folks started crossing the walls. Black people and brown people and white people and poor people and rich people started hanging out with each other and eating together and doing life together in community. And the city looked on and they're like, we don't even have a frame of reference. We don't have a word to describe that. And some of them got upset. And so they came to the church and they're like, hey, what the junk? You can't be doing that. And the Christians were like, well, we're already doing it. So I guess, I don't know what you want us to do now. And they're like, fine, we're going to come up with a nickname to make fun of you. We don't like what you're doing. This whole loving people across the walls. You can't do that. Looks like what Jesus would do. We're going to call you Christianos, little Christ, because you're just trying to be Jesus' mini-me's. That's all you are. You're like mini-me Jesus, idiots. Ha, 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 ha. And the church is like, brilliant. This is a word picture for what we're trying to thank you. That actually helps us out a lot. We're going to roll with that. We're going to go ahead and call ourselves Christians from now on. That's how the word Christian got invented. They're trying to make fun of these people who said, look, showing the love of Jesus means that everybody, no matter who they are, no matter where they've been, no matter what they look like, no matter what they've done, can join in community together across our differences. Because we have this mega, crazy, generous love. That's what it's all about. It was a whole new word to describe a whole new concept. That's not even the only new word in this passage. When John talks about love, it's this Greek word agape, which is a word that the writers of the New Testament made up because they had all these different words for love in Greek. And they're like, no. This Jesus thing, like we got some concepts of love, but God giving his entire life, allowing himself to be killed for like messed up, jacked up idiots who rejected him. That is not any kind of loving that we have a word for. We're going to make up this new one, agape. So here are the Christians in the first century reading what John writes in his letter about agape. How like we know that we've crossed from death into life because of this agape. And you got to imagine at this point, they're like, all right, cool, I'm in. But short of dying, you said like we're supposed to give up our lives for each other like Jesus did, but I'm not suicidal. I am captivated by the love of Jesus. I want to do the whole living beyond me thing. But short of laying down my life, what practically might it look like to like live out this Jesus love on a daily basis? And John knows that they're going to read it and ask that. And he knows that years later, other people like us are going to read it and ask that. And in verse 17, he's like, I'm so glad you asked. You're going to be really sorry that you asked. Oh man, you wish that you hadn't. But I do have an answer for you. Here you go. He says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, now time out. Notice he doesn't add a lot of context to that. He doesn't say, if anyone who's rich has material possessions. If anyone who has a lot to spare has material possessions. If anyone who's got some extra has material possessions. He doesn't qualify possessions either. He doesn't say if anyone who has a lot of possessions, if anyone has extra possessions. He says if anyone, and in the Greek that literally means anyone, has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need. Remember, your brother or sister is anybody your life crashes into who could use some love. All right, so if you got some money and you see a need, he's talking to you. And I got to warn you, what he says next is so graphic that our modern translations have softened it a little bit. They churchified it because you're not supposed to be inappropriate or gross in church, okay? So they're like, we can't say that in the Bible. So the NIV that I use a whole lot, it says this: if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them. Okay, but the Greek there says klese to splankna autu. So, whew. I'm just kidding, I know you don't know Greek. We got new people in here like, what kind of church is this? This is what that means. This is what that means. If anyone sees somebody with need and locks up the bowels of him from him. Now, kleise, locks up, that literally means to prevent passage at an opening. I'm going to say it again just to make sure we are all picking up the word picture John is laying down here. Locks up the bowels of him from him means prevent passage at an opening. We tracking? You're all glad you came to church today, aren't you? Don't be mad at me. John put it in the Bible. You guys should read it. It's a fascinating book. But check it out. This is what he's saying. He says, if you see someone in need and you suddenly find yourself financially constipated, you're full of something, but it's not the love of Jesus. Write that down. That's what he means. Okay? Then he asks us this question that we got to ask ourselves. You got to ask you, I got to ask me, any of us who occasionally find ourselves financially constipated. Okay? He asks us this question. If that happens, if you see need right in front of you and you experience financial constipation, how can the love of God be in that person? That's a rhetorical question. For John, there's only one answer. John, who saw with his eyes, who has scarred into his brain the picture of Jesus beaten and bleeding up on a cross. Who ate breakfast on a beach with Jesus a couple days later, who figured out this is exactly what happened. God stepped in. Out of eternity into history to be with us. And then said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. I didn't give out of my extra, I didn't give out of my excess. I gave more than I had to spare. I gave my life in love for you. John's like, if God did that, who are we? How dare we decide to shut down our compassion? If we're able to see need in front of us and all around us and respond by closing our hands tightly around what we have, if we get so consumed with the inward focus and self-absorption of chasing the American dream that we shut down our willingness to be generous and live sacrificially and give generously, then we're missing it. The mega love of Jesus we've received doesn't allow for that possibility. In my house, we have this bedtime routine where we tuck the kids in and we say some prayers, and then sometimes they ask me to sing a song. And that's just a trick to stay up later, because I'm not a good singer. They're getting nothing out of it other than a couple more minutes to be awake, but I'll do it, I guess. And we have a wide and eclectic range of songs that we sing at bedtime in the Howard house. Some pastors probably sing their kids, Jesus Loves Me. We do anything from Run DMC to Warren Zevon. And the other day I had this interesting interaction. Jimmy asked me to sing Blowin' in the Wind, which is a challenging song by Bob Dylan. It says, how many years can a mountain exist before it's washed to the sea? How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? How many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? How many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blown in the wind. One of my twins afterwards asked me, Daddy, what does he mean? How many ears can one man have? We have 2 ears. That is a great observation. This is a really practical question when you're 5, but it's kind of a haunting one when you're older. And so I told him, well, here's the thing, man. You're right. We do have 2 ears, but not everybody uses those ears to hear when people are hurting and to listen when they're crying out for help. And so Bob Dylan thinks some of those people might need more ears. And he's 5, so it went totally over his head. He understood nothing of what I said, but I was reading 1 John 3 this week, and I was like, John understands it. For him, the answer is clear. If the love of Jesus lives in us, we cannot turn our heads and pretend that we just didn't see. We can't require more than the 2 ears we've got to hear when people cry. You guys, John couldn't even imagine a financially constipated follower of Jesus. For him, that's an oxymoron. It does not exist. He's not trying to be a jerk, and he's not trying to be oppressive and lay something heavy on us when he says this. He's trying to set us free by helping us understand how big God's love is. It's something he doesn't want from us. It's something he wants for us, because there is life to be found. There's meaning to be found. There's impact to be found in giving our lives away, in realizing how awesome the love of Jesus is, being filled up by it and pouring it out all over the world. I think today for us, like for you, if that's not how you find yourself responding, if you find yourself clenching your fists around your stuff and your money and your finances and your resources, then you gotta glance up from your self-focus, because what you're gonna see when you do is that your life is aimed towards something, but that something just isn't Jesus. John's letting us know if crashing into need causes you to tense up, maybe you just don't get it yet. Maybe this gospel message has become like a story or a fairy tale to you, like something that maybe occurred 2,000 years ago, but doesn't actually affect you. And when that happens, faith becomes and life becomes all about you. It turns you inward. And it limits the meaning that you can find and the love that you can share and the impact that you can make in this life. Because when the significance of the gospel really dawns on us, when the fact that Jesus really did that God really stepped in and took our punishment, when we get it, that he gave his life for us, but he also gave his life for that person who's in need, then we can not only give our time and our abilities and our resources generously to them, but we can do it with joy and happiness in our hearts, because we can realize we have an opportunity to make a difference for Jesus in the world. And that's a gift. We can rejoice at the chance we've been given to do for others in a moment what they cannot do for themselves. Because that's the heartbeat of the gospel. That's the big idea, right? Jesus did for me what I can't do. While I was still a sinner, while I was all messed up, while I was cut off, Jesus made a way. And then he invited me into a lifestyle of sharing his radical, generous love with the world around me. John finishes up his thoughts on this in verse 18 by writing, "Dear children, let us not love with words and speech. Let's not just talk about it on Sunday mornings while we're sitting there. Let's not stand up and sing songs about it. Let's not go to house groups and have a discussion about it, but with actions and in truth." Like, let's allow this crazy, ridiculous love of God to move from our thoughts into our behaviors and walk out into a world that's longing for love and hurting for hope with open hands, ready to bless everybody around us because of the way we've been blessed, ready to give in the same manner that we've received from God. That's what it looks like to be transformed by Jesus and to follow him. It's not an add-on to faith. This isn't like bonus points for mature Christians who've been following Jesus for a really long time and got everything else ironed out. It's not the cherry on top. It's not the finishing touch. No. This is where we start. This is the baseline. It's the foundation. It is the thing that is meant to define the church. That's why we do Reach Des Moines at Revision. That's why we do so much of what we do. Why every time there's 5 Sundays in a month, we cancel our services on the 5th Sunday and spread hundreds of people and thousands of dollars across our city to serve nonprofits who are doing great things to help people flourish. That's why our groups serve once a month. That's why we set aside a percentage of every dollar that comes in to just give away to people who call in and have needs. That's why we're partnering with the Timothy Initiative this month. TTI is an organization that plants churches among the least reached people on this planet, that sends church planters into regions where people have never even heard the good news of Jesus' love, to places where it's illegal to be a Christian, where it's illegal to speak Jesus' name. And these church planters are risking their lives. They're willing to give more than they have to spare, to lay down their lives for the sake of the gospel, because they're desperate for people to know how much Jesus loves them. They're gonna give everything they've got, but what they do not have is financial resources to complete their training and buy the supplies that they need, but we do. We have financial resources, and so we are going to do for them in this moment what they cannot do for themselves. We pledged $10,000 to TTI to cover the cost of building a brand new church plant training center in South Sudan, and also to cover the cost of the first 3 churches at least that it's gonna launch. And I have great news and bad news this morning about that. I'll start with the good news. We're not a church that has a whole lot of financial margin, but we have the $10,000 to give to TTI. We have it, all right? So it's good news. Bad news is it's still in your wallets. So, next week, Next week, we're taking a special above and beyond offering for the Timothy Initiative. And I would love for all of you to be a part of that, to just pray this week, okay, God, I'm coming with open hands. How is it that you want me to be a part of this? Whether it's 2 cents or $2 or $200, whatever it looks like, we're going to do for them what they can't do. And we're doing that. And we're doing so much of what we do. And we're committed to radical, beyond our means generosity on a corporate communal level, because that's what the love of Jesus looks like, and we want our world to taste and see that it is good. We believe that it can change this city. And this morning, my challenge is for every single one of us to commit to that same lifestyle and that same lens through which we see the world on an individual level. And I know it's challenging. It's scary for all of us who grew up in like the self-indulgent materialism of this culture to think about opening up our hands and not clinging tightly to our stuff. But all of us have done this. All of us have lived in America long enough. We know there's something empty in holding tightly to our stuff and our money and our resources. And there's something profoundly beautiful and fulfilling about opening up our hands and allowing ourselves and our lives to be a conduit through which God's grace and love flows to the broken people around us. And so I want to challenge you this week. And look, I don't know everything you're going to face. I don't know what hurting or broken people your life is going to intersect with and you're going to encounter. But I want to invite you to have a Larry Walters moment and decide, I am not just going to sit there anymore. There's no way. That faith that's in my head is moving into my heart and my hands, and I'm going to do something different. I'm going to live this week in every moment and see the world through different eyes by asking this simple question: what does love require of me? It's a different way to process our interactions, but it's this idea that if the love of Jesus, that mega generous, self-sacrificial love lives in me, then in this situation, in this interaction, in front of this person, in front of this need, what does love require of me? What if we began to ask that question? What if we began to see the world through that lens? Like, what if all of us had a Larry Walters moment and decided, I will not live and die passively just sitting here? Like, whatever it looks like, I'm going to do what love requires of me when I crash into another life, into a brother or a sister in need. Like, I can't help but wonder how different the world would be if the church began to get this right. If we chose to live with the radical, countercultural, generous love of Jesus. And I'm convinced if we all decide to do that, if we decide I'm going to live beyond me, we will create the future we were born to create, and we will write a better story for our broken world. Will you guys pray with me? God, thank you for inviting us into what you're doing to heal the world, to draw people to yourself, to share your love with people who are just yearning to breathe in the oxygen of that love. God, I pray that you would do a thing in us, that you transform not just our minds, but our hearts and our hands, that we'd walk out of this place willing to see the world, see the people around us, see every interaction through this lens of what does love require of me here? God, would you just use us? Thank you for the resources we've been given. Would you just open up our hearts and open up our hands so that we could point a broken world toward you, toward the incredible, gracious, generous, abundant love that you have given us. We just thank you for that love. In Jesus' name, amen.